looking at the long-term and short-term effects of climate change, I would like to look at it from two angles, as in the sort of economic and also the social aspect to it. Oftentimes, there's a lot of talk about the economic implications of climate change. And I think let's establish it from the start that the climate change effects right now are quite evident nearly every part of the world at this point in time. Why I see it from an economic standpoint is that there's an impact on lives on life. We've seen that the increasing level of droughts, and other changing weather patterns, it make it very unpredictable for local communities. The ordinary farmers who have been accustomed to applying certain methods. Now there is a challenge whereby how do they adjust? How do they adapt, as we like to say, to the current changing times? And there is that limited support in that regard. So because of that, now you have issues of food security. And not only for small and developing states, other developing countries, there is that challenge because they always say a hungry nation cannot be a prosperous nation, and that is, I think, one of the key economic unfortunate situations with climate change, both in the short term and in the long term, because then adapting now to meet this change, it comes at a cost. And many states at this point in time, particularly post-COVID, do not have that ability to deal with this cost. So the economic looking at it from the lives and livelihoods, and that sort of multi-sectoral impact, whether it be agriculture, whether it be health, for example. And I think it's often something that is not really spoken of as much as it should be, but the direct impact of climate change on health, and then the birth of new diseases, particularly in tropical regions, and how that is placing a strain on our health sectors. So that's only from the economic standpoint, but also on the social angle as well. In the context of, for example, when you speak about loss and damage, what you like to call non-economic losses, because there is a significant mental impact which the climate crisis has on individuals and communities. When we look at it from the social aspect, the mental losses and the loss of culture, and particularly to children, indigenous communities, like I said, from small and developing states, we bear the brunt of it. We're on the front line, even though that we are not a major contributor to the climate crisis. But yeah, the multi-sectoral impact on our lives, our livelihoods, and people in general, it's a significant threat. Understand that countries would be guided by the laws and so on. We need the laws in place to guide any action. So that's the fundamental foundation. So just to take it a bit on a journey from the top level and bringing it down. So of course, we know that at the higher multilateral level, the UN General Assembly in last year, 2022, would have adopted this resolution calling on states, essentially international organizations, to scale up efforts to ensure a clean, healthy, sustainable environment for all. So that is at this sort of multilateral level. Of course, it is not a legally binding agreement on the 93 states. But what it does is that it provides this, I would like to say, an armory for NGOs, for other groups and other civil society organizations to utilize that sort of political commitment to have that sort of trickle-down effect to ensure that this right, is integrated within national legislation and actually can be implemented. And we ensure that the actions which are replicated in country reflect that. So there's that gap. So the question is then, how do we fill that gap? Who fills that gap? And that is where our role as, for example, youth organizations, the CSOs come into play to ensure that we can, first of all, be well informed. Because I think that is the critical thing. What exactly does it mean to sort of understand that it's a healthy environment? We have that right to a healthy environment. And because I already been in any sort of advocacy effort must be guided by, clear evidence and science and research and so on. But I say all of this to show that as campaigners and whatnot, that's our ammunition we can use at this multilateral level. Because if not, it'll just be a resolution which, oh yes, states say they will agree to or whatever, but then nothing happens on the ground. So it's important that that to ensure that mobilization efforts happens at the national level, that we engage with other groups with similar interests in ensuring that we sensitize the general population on what exactly this means, because the general population would be key to supporting any effort. But how do we make that linkage between how the climate crisis affects these with the various sectors within our communities. Because of course, I always say that within advocacy, there's not one size fits all. It has to be context specific, because an approach which maybe we apply in developed world may not work in the developing countries to ensure that it is enshrined in national legislation. There has to be that flexibility, and that is why I always believe this bottom-up approach is key. Of course, a well-informed bottom-up approach is key, but taking that political momentum from the top and bringing it down to the various sectoral aspects within our communities. And I think then you begin to build a cadre of a citizenry who are able to support lobbying efforts. Because, like I always say, legislation, is done or whatever, influenced by politicians and so on. And politicians listen to the people. The actions are influenced by the people. So it's about getting, the people on board, getting them to understand, getting us to understand why it is that. And of course, I think I always say that, we tend to move when we understand how a particular situation affects our lives and livelihoods. And I think that is key. Fundamental key is that ensure that we are backed by science and research. I believe is the foundation for any solid advocacy effort. Why I say that? Because we live in an era where information is power, information is key. And there is always elements of misinformation and disinformation, which can tend to sway our messaging and that kind. So it's important that that is where the academic community plays a critical role in ensuring that we have we are whatever messaging is pushed out is backed by clear and that is available science in that exactly yes, we have this trend, we have established this trend. We know, for example, this is perhaps the economic loss or the economic consequences to a particular. So this is a potential economic loss, but this is also the solution. This is also what can happen if we ensure that this is, maintained at this level and it's enshrined in national education. So it's important that we show this sort of, as we call a tripartite approach, the foundation of the research, why it is necessary now, and also forward-looking in terms of seeing that what would be the overall effect, the positive effect, of course, for such a level. So science and research, and of course, that is where the academic community, think tanks, and so on play a critical role. So if I were to say is that it's important to establish linkages to the key driving sectors within an economic space. Transition, that sort of what I like to call a green transition. And it is important because we have to be pushing the solution-oriented approach. It has to be an approach which can show us that if we are to push this at the legislative level, this could be the impact at the socioeconomic level as well. What is that linkage? And I think that is how we engage private sector to sort of play, cast a greater eye on it as well. Because, oftentimes human rights and, private sector oftentimes can be a very controversial space, but we can make a positive linkage. And I think the climate crisis provides an opportunity for us to bridge that gap, recognizing the impact which the climate crisis has on our health. And of course, I think we would understand that not having a healthy environment contributes to a not so healthy population, and a not so healthy labor force is not good for any economy. It's not good for the private sector. But how do we ensure we promote this sort of messaging, promote the practices that would sort of encourage others to get on board? Because I think it's important that we do not just highlight the bad, but because I'm positive, there are examples we can highlight that where states are making great strides in terms of from the human rights and the climate angle. So how do we ensure that they approach whatever methodologies they employ? How do we ensure that we replicate that or encourage others to replicate that? And of course, that is where other agencies, think tanks, NGOs play a critical role. Because I think I've mentioned NGOs and CSOs quite a bit because when you talk about human rights and climate crisis, I think I don't want to say they have the main role to play, but they do have a substantial role to play in driving positive change that is required.